Hey all, I've finally gotten home after being at Houston, finally able to sit down and talk about the deck and how we made it up into top 64. First thing I want to say is that the event was super amazing to be a part of. This was my first experience doing any sort of TCG competition like that, and I was blown away. There were so many people, so many good players that I sat against, and everyone was super kind and very understanding of my ability to maneuver physical cards. I thought that'd be a much bigger problem than it was, but it was totally fine. Everyone was great, and just verbalizing everything made everything go super smoothly. Even at a top cut, my opponent was, he looked at me a little weird, but yeah, for valid reasons. But it all went very smoothly. Everyone was great, and just having conversations with people, like in the feature match, just having conversations with Billionaire the entire time we're playing was super chill and relaxing, and we had a great time. But let's get into the actual meat and potatoes of this, and how did Yasuo actually manage to make it into top cut of this event? So first thing we're going to do when we look at this is look at the battlefield spread and talk about this. Zon Warrens is always our game one, because what it is doing for us is allowing us to cycle through our cards much better. As we go through the main deck, you'll see that the main deck is a bunch of 2-ofs and 1-ofs, which Zon Warrens helps us with, because we can just start pitching and cycling and getting down lower to our deck, so we're more likely to see all of these tools at least once. This is pretty important for a game one. This way your sideboard can be inside of your main board. Makes your matchups a lot more even across the board. So if I'm sitting against a Yi, I have my tools for Yi. If I'm sitting against a Kai'Sa, I have my tools for Kai'Sa. It all makes sense. Zon Warrens is great for that. Our going first battlefield is always Targon's Peak, because what we want to do with that is just to push 2/2 drops on turn 2 and ready up 2 runes and just hold up interaction on their point while we have 2 guys. This is a very strong board state for most decks, because they just can't get through, they can't conquer anything. If I'm repping an On Guard Defy or a Discipline onto something, it gets very difficult for them to even try to take. So this battlefield is extremely strong for us going first, and even if they are using it a little bit, it's fine for us because we have also just more interaction than most decks to begin with. Windswept Tillich will be our going second battlefield. This is mainly because it is a good catch-up battlefield, where even if they are threatening to go to 2 points if they're threatening to go to 1 point on turn 1, I can threaten to go to 2, because I can always tap my guy and use as many interaction with, when I say tap, I'm talking about the Yasuo Legend. I can use the Yasuo Legend to move the guy and take both battlefields, representing still 3 runes of interaction that I can use. So I'm always threatening to be ahead on point tempo with Windswept Tillich. It's a great catch-up card for that game. I actually feel like that game is one of Yasuo's strongest. Just having access to ganking is super powerful for him. It allows him to, cycle his guy every turn. He gets to conquer both battlefields with just one. Sometimes he doesn't have to use his legend for it. It's a great time. The rune split we'll talk about is very simple. Every deck pretty much can go 6/6 and be totally fine, unless you're requiring early game power, which is something this meta doesn't need. Early game power is not at all helpful, because most of the games will go longer. Kai'Sa is a deck that will really punish you for using early game power, so most decks can't afford to do it. So 6/6 is generally the baseline for every deck, because mana screw doesn't happen until later stages of the game. As we go through this list, we will find that generally what this deck is an answers deck. That is the core of it. We are not trying to play a game plan, which could make some people really uneasy, but we are just trying to take the opponent off of theirs. We want to always play where our opponent is weakest. So as we're looking at these cards, it's important to know that all of these cards are extremely modular in their uses, and no card is used for one specific thing or one specific way in any specific matchup. All these cards are versatile tools that we're using in very different ways in every matchup. That makes this deck probably the hardest deck to pilot in set 1, because it requires you to know exactly what your opponent wants to do and then play around everything that they're going to do. But that's what I find so exciting about this deck too, when making it, finding all of the right ratios for all the answers took quite some time, and getting it exactly precise that I wanted took months. I think I've been on this deck concept for 2.5 months, maybe 3. And so each time, every small change in meta changed cards. So it was quite rewarding to eventually get there with this deck. 2 of Defy on the main board can be pretty contentious, but it can be really dead in the hand for certain matchups like even Kai'Sa. There's not a lot that we actually want to defy in the Kai'Sa list. The only things we want to defy are really like Void Seeker and Smokescreen. Everything else is pretty small potatoes. Sometimes we have to defy Hexray. But having 2 here feels totally fine for most matchups. We only bring in the 3rd if there are certain decks that are really destroying us with specific cards like kill spells in yellow, or in green mirrors where having access to the 1+ pump matters the most. We should also talk about the Chosen Champion a little bit, which is only green Yasuo. It can only ever be green Yasuo. It can never be purple Yasuo. Why is that? So green Yasuo represents having a top end guaranteed whenever you need it. There are a lot of matchups where we have to use green Yasuo as our entire game plan, like Yi Tempo, and that we put all of our eggs into this basket. Originally, Yasuo was very much a Protect the President deck, and you could still run it that way, and that's a mode that's a part of this deck, is to play the Protect the President, but that's why it has to be him. This card is very strong and allows us to take the points that we need to, especially for a deck like Tempo Yi. We pretty much always slam this on turn 3. And I can go into that at a later point, but generally just accept that this card gets slammed on turn 3 against Yi. And what it allows us to do is always take very favorable trades into their 2-drops, takes care of them stacking units. Stacking is very scary for them to do because Yasuo can just take care of everything he wants. And it also means that if you charm the Yasuo, it pretty much is guaranteed to take a trade. So Yasuo is our carry in a lot of matchups. It carries the Yi matchup, it can carry the Teemo matchup, it can carry a lot of them. Any green deck, you play the Yasuo and just swing it around. Set matchup is very Yasuo focused as well. There's no matchup where purple Yasuo will help us do anything because it requires us to use cards that we just don't want to play more copies of, like Ride the Wind and Foff. Stack Deck. Stack Deck is an extremely good card. This card basically means that you're playing a 36 card deck with immense added consistency. This card, just play it. There's not really much to say about how you use this card. Sometimes you want to mull it away in your starting hand because having the 1 here is still a tempo loss because you're still spending 1 energy to do it. But it can also help you a lot to find your 2-drop if you're going second and you have no unit in hand. You can just keep the stack deck to ensure you have at least a unit on play to keep it in open hand, but most of the time I will just mull this. It's a good consistency tool, but you don't need consistency if you can just draw the card anyway. Seeing an extra 2 is nice, but it's just not worth the extra 1 added when you can just draw the card from the mulligan. That's probably the biggest thing that I see people do wrong with Stack Deck, is thinking that it's so strong so you keep it. Just get rid of it. Gust is a pretty contentious card as well. It's low impact sometimes, but it can also entirely flip certain matchups like Annie and Teemo. Gust is very helpful on going second as well, when you can just play your 2-drop and then threaten a Gust on whatever they push up. That way you're guaranteed to take back tempo. There are a lot of decks that will want to push up their 2-drop and then play another body on top of that 2-drop to protect it from the Yasuo sweep, and Gust stops them from doing that. Against Kai'Sa, can be pretty helpful as well if they play a sentry on turn 1 to just take away their sentry, and there will be very little turns where that sentry becomes helpful again. So you deny them a draw from the sentry, and you gain back tempo against Kai'Sa, which can be very important for getting to the late game at a safe point. This card is probably the only card in the list that I could see myself changing at Houston. I think I run 3 total, 2 in main and 1 inside. I think I only ever need 2 total, and I could have opened 1 slot extra. There were a lot of games where towards the end of it, I was just ignoring my sideboard and just not bringing in any Gusts, just because the consistency to get that point tempo was not enough. I needed something a bit more top-heavy. So, good card. It also just completely solos the Annie matchup again. Like, if they try to push in their 2-drop and you can get point tempo and you gust it, you just win the game on the spot. You get tempo, and you just play in base for the rest of the game, and you just win against Annie. Her hold ability is very low, so gust allowing you to get the tempo back, extremely strong. We'll talk about Unguard and Discipline as a pair. These two cards are staples for any green deck. Having a buff spell is a staple of pressures that this deck represents. Whenever you are holding up any energy, your opponent has to play around not just the printed cost of the unit, but also it +2 most of the time. Having this card is very important to what the deck wants to do. It's allowing us to use very efficient mana costs to get very strong temporary bonuses to catch opponents off guard. It means we can make our things trade easily. There's not much I really need to say about these cards. These cards are just great value for their costs and help us to mitigate some of Kai'Sa's removal as well. Now on to our first little spicy bit here, is a 1 of Charm. So originally, Charm has been one of the best cards of the set, right? It's a 1-cost kill spell. And on the surface, that is great. For Yasuo, originally I didn't have it in at all, because Yasuo doesn't really need to be pulling people into him. He wants to attack into them. So Charm always felt very awkward. However, the problem with not having it at all is that your opponents never have to respect any amount of base removal from you. So you have to have the Charm to force your opponents to respect base interaction. And it's a 1 of just so that they have to play around it, basically. If you show it in game 1, they have to play around it for the rest of the set. If you're in an open deck list, then they always have to play around it regardless, and they might just disrespect it because it's a 1 of, and then you can just win on the spot by having it in your hand. Having access to unique effects like this is what makes cards very good. It can also just be used as a FOF in the late game, where instead of using FOF, you can use FOF on your turn to just get your guy off the battlefield to easily conquer. That's what you can use FOF to. That's what you can use Charm for in this case. So it acts as a third-ish copy of Fight or Flight, while also having this unique special effect of itself. Scrap Heap was also part of a recent innovation with it. I know Annie's also running the Scrap Heaps. I put this in before Annie started doing it, because I'm a hipster. I did it before it was cool. You're welcome. This was my solution to the Kai'Sa problem. Earlier in testings, we would have Dreaming Tree, and we would try to just outdraw the Kai'Sa with Dreaming Tree and our buff spells, but the problem became that Kai'Sa just started using it better than us, and every game it would just be a flip of who drew the cards that interacted with Dreaming Tree, and I needed to find a different solution to that. And the solution became Zon Warrens and Scrap Heap, so that we can always keep up enough to the hand tempo that Kai'Sa had. And this also just helps consistency in other matches too. We had a little bit of space in the sideboard. We can add this and have a really strong sort of volatile start on Zon Warrens, where we can just have more cards than the opponent, which means more answers that we can find. This card always gets sideboarded out. Well, I say always, but pretty much always will get sideboarded out after game 1 when you run Zon. The only time that I keep it in is against Aurora decks, because against Aurora, a lot of things don't matter. Like Gust doesn't matter. There are certain cards that don't matter, like Zonia's doesn't really matter against Aurora either. A lot of the top end doesn't matter against Aurora, so we just run more Scrap Heaps to potentially give ourselves more, cantrip draw if we have to play it, or just we have a merchant on board, which stays on board because Aurora's not really going to kill it very often, and can just get lots of value out of it. Mask of Foresight as a 1 of in the main and a 1 of inside. This card is extremely potent. It breaks a lot of early game math for the deck. If they push in a 2-drop, now our 2-drop can trade, and we have permanent advantage for the rest of the game. It's a very strong card into green mirrors, because it is allowing you to get over those breakpoints, and green mirrors can devolve into whoever has the most buffs in hand wins, basically. More interaction wins in the green mirrors. And Mask turns that on its head by giving you a permanent buff, always. So this is a pretty important card for some of those mirrors, but why is it so low in the list? If it's a strong card, why do we run not 3? The problem is because it's only strong as 1. If we ever draw 2, we get pretty sad about that. Having 2 masks on board is not very helpful. One mask, extremely useful because it breaks the math for the game. Like a 2-drop going over a 2-drop is important. But there's not much that really gets gained from having that extra point of might permanently. The difference between 2 and 1 in this case is very low. So having 2 masks on board is not as helpful as you would think. Having 1 mask on board can be game-changing. So we want to run enough copies that we can see it in some games and have a nice boost, but never run enough that we get bricked on them both. So we have 1 in main for that reason, and then we bring in the other one inside once we fix the ratios of our units. And now that we are at that point, let's talk about the unit ratio first. We will talk about the individual units in just a second, but I just want to talk about the ratios that I have. A very important part of this deck is that it is extremely 2-drop heavy. We have 11 total 2-drops, 10 in main board, and 1 in sideboard, and 3 of a 3-drop. These ratios are what makes the deck different, in my opinion, where most Yasuos are running either only 9 2-drops or even less and do a ramping version. Having this amount of 2-drops is what makes this deck this deck. What this is allowing us to do is to consistently be able to do the 2-unit push onto battlefields. This is a very strong setup into Aurora decks. This is a very strong setup into Yi. This is a very strong setup into any deck that can't break both, which is very few. Very few decks are made right now to conquer both battlefields on turn 2. Or even deal with that. So either they can take 1 and we still have 1 guy that awakens on the other battlefield, and now we're in a pretty strong position. We're at 3 points and can do whatever we want. They had to use a card to get over our guy and couldn't develop. It's just a win for us in every metric. So it's that play pattern that this deck is based on the most, and is what allows us to run away with games. So why do we do 10 then, and not 11? Why do we have the 1 2-drop inside? Well, the reason for that is because we have to go second sometimes, right? So we take a little bit of a hedge on game 1, where we will run 10 2-drops, which gives us a pretty solid chance, about a 70% chance of getting 2 2-drops on turn 2 if we're going first. But it's also giving us the ability to have our wielder in our hand going second. We want to hedge this bet just to increase our odds around the board. Game 1 is a very important game because it can decide, like games 2 and 3 are very biased against whoever is going first, because not only do they have the battlefield choice advantage, they also just have the turn advantage, and the advantages start compounding in the next few games. So game 1 is super important to get right, and hedging for going second is valuable. Now we can talk about the individual 2-drops that we have and what role they are serving. Traveling Merchant, I think, is fairly obvious. He is our card cycler. In this deck, we are looking for specific answers to specific decks' problems that they are giving us, and Merchant is just doing that in spades. He is letting us get rid of whatever card is dead in our hands, be that Azonia's, be that the charm that we just don't need for the base interaction, and helping us find the things that we do need, be that a new buff or whatever. Most of the time what we're doing with him is also just getting rid of our 2-drops in the late game, because we don't need them anymore. We're pretty heavy on those, so they can sometimes clog off our hand, and Merchant just turns that on his head. What would be considered a late game dud draw is now just a regular draw with Merchant to help us find our real answers. Merchant's going to be pretty pivotal for purple decks in general. I don't think that's a hot take. So, great card just to get onto the board and keep our cards cycling. Stalwart Poro, 3-might guy, very strong. Clockwork Keeper is a 2 of in this, because he is by far the worst. Well, him and Tide Turner. He is a really bad one to play on turn 1, but his effect is good enough in the late game that he wins over some of the others, right? Like, you don't want a Stalwart Poro on turn 1, but you will want a Clockwork Keeper. Sorry, you want a Stalwart Poro on turn 1. You don't want a Clockwork Keeper on turn 1, but you want a Clockwork Keeper on turn 5 over a Stalwart Poro on turn 5. Now, we still always need the 2-drop, so we still have to run some number of 2-drops, but having a 2-drop that has a strong effect on a later turn is what adds some consistency and flexibility to the deck. Choosing when we pay this cost is very important, gives us a cycle, and just a guy that gets a point. So it's an okay card. It's never a 3 of in the deck because it is just by far the worst 2-drop here. Spending the power to draw is not as helpful as it could be. And let's round out the 2-drops. So we're talking about Tide Turner. Tide Turner is my goat. Love this guy. He catches so many opponents off guard. To start, he's just a 2-drop, so you just play him on turn 2 if he's all you have. But using him as the hidden card is really powerful. He represents threats that the opponent can't deal with fully. And just having a unit that you can even cheat out is strong in some matchups like Annie, where sometimes just having an extra unit that you're just tempoing out, paying for a power instead of energy, matters a lot. But he's only a 2 of, because there are a lot of decks that he does very little against, like Yi. Tide Turner does very little into Yi, because you're never getting into a situation where he has to push into you very often. I mean, you would like that, but you're not getting to the point where you have like a Mind Splitter on the board and you're hiding the Tide Turner and trying to do the things with that. Tide Turner is much better in the game states where you're going super long and you're going to be holding with your bigger units, and Yi just doesn't allow you to do that. So that's why he's only a 2 of, and that's why the third is inside, because he will be our extra consistency when we go first, and he also represents very strong combat tricks in the late game. Rebuke. So this was actually the only change I made to the list while I was at Houston. I originally had 2 Rebukes in main and 2 Mind Splitters until we did the pre-registered skirmish that would guarantee you, that would get you a bye if you went undefeated. And I played into like 5 Kaisas during that. So after seeing that, I assumed that the field would be much more flooded with Kaisas than it would be on the actual day of the event. That turned out to be wrong, so I think I regret changing this, and I should have just stuck with my guns, because I ended up running into 4 Yis, and having this Rebuke in main deck would have been more useful than having the extra Mind Splitter in main deck. I think I should have just stuck to the math and the prediction that I did and not use the small sample size to bias this decision. So while this is what ended up getting played, I would probably have reverted this change if I had the hindsight that I do now. Still ended up being okay. I found it in the games that I needed it to, and having the third Mind Splitter definitely was helpful into the Kaisa that I played against. But in general, I think I should have just stuck to my guns with that. So now let's talk about what Rebuke is doing. This card is just a powerful trick as well. It removes anything it gets over Defy. For Yi, this is probably our most important card. It's removing all their big guys from the board so that we don't have to deal with it and we just speed run points. Rebuke is our best way to deal with Aurora decks that just bring out one big guy. We just get it out of there. And even against Kaisa, we can use this against Darius and Watcher to regain the tempo. It's a very cheap card energy-wise. This mostly comes down in the late game, but you can sometimes use it early game if you need to, if you know that you have super point advantage. Against Kaisa, this is a late game card. Against Yi, this is an early game card. And against Annie, this can also be an early game card. Against Annie, all you want to do is regain the point tempo, so Rebuke can do that. I've rebuked a Kaisa that was just going to an open battlefield, just so that I have the tempo and she doesn't draw a card, and that was worth it. Zhonya's was another card I didn't run very often. I added it in pretty late into the process, maybe about 2 weeks ago, as a way to deal with Kaisa better again. I didn't think I needed it for a while, and I started playing it, I started feeling good again, and it also had strong plays into Aurora, as you would see on the stream if you watched that. I'll put the link into that in the description below. Where you can just keep using Yasuo to trade into a big guy that he has and still live. That was a very important line, and it would just help against Kaisa. Whenever they would try to kill something, you would just bring it back. A lot of the times I would even use this early on a Wielder of Water in Kaisa, just to make sure that I have a guy. It's a little dangerous with Wielder of Water, because if it's just Wielder of Water, then they can just Falling Star. And then I am sad, because I lost my Zhonya's and my Wielder for a Falling Star. But what can you do? It's a very much utility card. There's a lot of matchups I just get rid of it, because it's not very useful in, because things just don't die in a lot of matchups sometimes. Or at least not important things. But yeah, it's a card to keep in mind, a card to keep use the playlines. Wielder of Water we talked about a bit, but Wielder of Water is a card that can solo games on his own if you just keep him on battlefields and hold up interaction. He is just a very solid might number for his cost. 3 for 4 is a very impressive stat line, and using him on your going second game when you have Windswept Hillock means that he can pretty much sweep through any of the opponent's units. If they somehow are turn 2 conquering, like an Annie, who says they push their 2-drop and then play their sneaky, you can clear both with this Wielder of Water and still have 3 energy of interaction to deal with. So if they try to Void Secret, you can still defy that and then take both fields from the Annie and still have 2 up into their next turn, while presenting a 4-might unit. So it's a really strong card and can just run away with games if the opponents don't respect it enough. I think the best thing for a Kai'Sa to do is just to Falling Star this dude as soon as they see it. Even if he's just the only one on the board, you can't go for extra value, just get rid of him from the board. He can run away with games, and he's great for that. Mind Splitter is a card that I got a lot of hate for. Playing this card, I put in the list as my main solution to Kai'Sa. I wanted to see what would happen if I could just look at her hand and remove the Acathian Rain or the Time Warp or whatever. And that became pretty much the winning idea into Kai'Sa, was just put this card on the board on turn 3 or turn 4 every game. Look at the hand, take away whatever kills it, and just get him on the board and hold. That became the winning idea into Kai'Sa. And Mind Splitter is the only card that can make that happen. Into Kai'Sa, we are just looking for this guy and multiple of this guy. If we can play Mind Splitter into hold up interaction on that next turn when we have both on the board, we are feeling very strong. There is nothing more that I want in my hand than a Mind Splitter. I always keep it in hand. Even if I see 2 sometimes, I'll keep 2 in my hand into Kai'Sa because I want to just chain them over and over. This card is just extremely powerful. Being able to see the hand of the opponent means that I know exactly what cards I need to use in what order. And as an answers deck, that is super important. It tells me what answers I need, what answers I don't need. I can start cycling with my Merchant after I play the Mind Splitter to get rid of the cards that don't matter anymore after seeing their hand, and draw into something more useful. This card does everything that I wanted it to do and more. I found a lot more matchups that it found play in than I was expecting. And so this became a really strong contender for why the deck was playable in the first place. Raza was another card that was a late entry. He joined the fray when we added in the Zon and Scrap as just a tool to cheat out a big guy. Because that was the strategy that we had to play with Kai'Sa, is just get big guys on the battlefield and hold, and Raza was just an extra one of those. He also could represent a good mid-game play on Zon Warrens or if we had a Merchant, where sometimes we could just play him on turn 3 as a 5-cost 6-might unit. And that was okay. It doesn't feel bad, and he's just there to add some extra beef to the deck. When we were playing in Houston, there was a lot of times where my Kai'Sa opponent would see that I'm at 7, not enough to like Yasuo tap, and so they would take a very aggressive line, and then I would just play Raza and tap, and their eyebrows shoot up, because who's playing Raza? So there was a lot of surprise factor that this card had that contributed to some success. That is why I won 1 game into my Kai'Sa opponent in bracket. So yeah, this card ended up overperforming my expectations, and I've enjoyed it quite a bit. The sideboard is much of the same thing that we've talked about, and I will also be posting the image of the sideboard guide at this point, so you can see what's going in where, but all these cards that we've talked about except for Ride the Wind. Ride the Wind was the original inspiration for the deck, where I wanted to play super aggro Yasuo and just ride the wind on the opponent's turn to gain points off tempo and just run away with the game. And that worked for a bit, until people got better and started knowing how to play around Ride the Wind and respecting it as a card. Then that off-turn Ride the Wind never really landed as well as I wanted it to. So the card eventually got lower and lower on copies until it was almost cut. But I couldn't bear to fully get rid of it, since it was the very beginning of the deck, and it's such a cool effect and such a unique effect that I decided to keep it in. But I put it in the sideboard, and I would mainly bring it in for the game on Windswept. And that ended up being correct. It won me multiple games in bracket. Most notably, it was on stream against Billionaire, where it was my only way to start breaking through the board and finish off his hold with Aurora Yi. If that had been any other card in the deck, I would not have been able to win that game. So it made its place. There was another game in Swiss where my Leona opponent, I knew that they had about 3 stun cards in hand and a Shen, so I Ride the Wind on his turn, when he pushed in to make myself the defender, so that if he tries to stun me, then he goes back, and that ended up winning me the game there too. So this card eventually did exactly what it needed to do, and 1 of, I think, is the correct number for the same reason as Charm, where it's just this unique effect that you have to make the opponent play around or lose to if you have it. Okay, so let's talk about the matchups that I went through. My round 1 was against the Lee Sin. I think this player was a bit newer. The match went pretty quickly and pretty swiftly, nothing really of note in that. The Lee Sin matchup actually can be a little tough because he can just have more numbers than me. Having his 2 drops be 3 might because he buffed it, and mine only being 2 makes it really tough. It's like Lee Sin has a constant mask on the board and a green mirror, which can be pretty potent. But usually I don't have many issues with Lee Sins as the deck is a bit underdeveloped. So that round went by fine, and then the second round was versus a Yi. The Yi matchup can be quite flippy in general, where my best tool to deal with their 2 drops is my 6-cost Yasuo, so I tend to just have to play that out early and pray that they don't have a way to kill it with some Charm and double buff or something like that. Even if they take the trade, I'm okay with the trade, but like Charm and Primal will pretty much destroy that start with Yasuo. If I don't have the Yasuo, then there's very little I can do in the game as a whole. Sometimes you can eke out wins by getting a Mind Splitter on board and start beating over with that, but it's tough. Next I played against a Leona, which was a very tough matchup actually. The player didn't quite understand the Yasuo matchup, which is to be expected. Not many people are going to be practicing against Yasuo. But this one went 2-1 and was very, very close. I had to win it with an active defense Ride the Wind, where I could tell that his hand was mostly sitting on stuns and a Shen, which I had to rebuke in that game. That kind of hurt, having to rebuke a Shen. But I rode the wind to make myself the defender, which would have put me on 7 points, so I'd hold for 8. And the Leona just had no way to out it. All their stun cards are much better on defense than they are as the attacker, and since I put them into that attacking position, I was able to take the point and win the game off of that. Took a little bit of hand reading, which is a skill that I am not as good at, but I managed to squeak out that one. And the next game was a Yi. In this one, I actually had a bit of a problem in this game. I hadn't had this problem at all in any other games. I sat down to start playing the round, and we're playing the game. We're playing game 1, and I play a Ride the Wind to go to the other battlefield. Now, for the people who have looked at my deck list, you would know that I don't have Ride the Wind in main. It took me a few turns to realize what had happened. I looked down at my deck for trash, checking for Rasa, realized I had the Ride the Wind, was very confused on how I had it in game 1, and I ended up just conceding that game out of principle, which I don't regret. I think the actual rules for that sort of infraction is just a warning, and you continue to play the game as is if the offending player is one that found it. So if I would call judge there, I would get a warning, and the game would continue on. But I felt it was better to just take a game loss for that. I don't want to cheat a game in that way. I think my opponent was still winning, so I don't think it really changed the outcome very much. But I took that loss, and then we won the second game, and then the very third game, we got extremely lucky. So this was the board state in that third game. The Yi had much more development. I had 0 cards in hand, 3 runes up. It looks very clear that the Yi will win this game. What happens next is the Yi pushes the Kiana onto my Stalwart Poro. And I do the only thing that I could have done. With 0 cards in hand, I would reveal my Tide Turner to swap with the Merchant. This I knew would give me a draw. It gives me the ability to have an out. So I draw into a Discipline. The Yi opponent plays their own Discipline. I play mine onto the Poro in response. They let mine resolve. We both resolve the disciplines. They draw into another discipline themselves. I drew into a Defy. And this interaction ended up winning the game. They had to play a few Finder Centers just to draw and find an out, which they never ended up managing to do. This game was the closest game of the entire day. Having this extremely lucky sequence of cards is what managed to get me into top cut at the end of the day, because if losing this match, then I would not have made it. This is just to go to say that you should always play to your outs. Make sure that there is always a line that you can try to take to win the game. You should take it. This game was crazy. I had to just apologize to my opponent about that crazy sequence of top decks, but at the end of the day, that's just sort of how card games go, right? So we took that and went on to the next rounds. As we went, my next round was an Annie. This matchup is one that I hoped to see more of. Annie is a matchup that I play a lot because I test a lot with Sold Out, as you know, who sort of architected the entire Annie deck that we know and love, and the one that won the event. So I was very comfortable in this matchup. I ended up going 2-0 in this, and felt very good with it. I did get to use a fun little interaction in that game, where my opponent used Cleave on their Merchant and base to, play around Defy and to play around Gust, or so they thought. They push in, and because the Traveling Merchant has a move trigger, I'm able to respond to the move trigger before combat. So I gusted their Merchant in response to their move trigger, because Assault wasn't active yet, because there's no combat. It's little plays like this that make Yasuo so technical, and require you to know a lot of rules interaction in order to get the best bang for your buck. But that play ended up winning that game for me, essentially, because I got the tempo lead, and once I get the tempo lead, then the game is over in that matchup. So, didn't feel too bad about that matchup. And then next was my only loss in Swiss, which was against another tempo Yi. What happened in these games just ended up being, got top decked a lot. I played the Yasuo, and they knew to Charm and Primal, so I lost my Yasuo for nothing, and that happened again in other games. I had to play around. I played into 2 Charms in those games and just ended up losing. I didn't feel bad about how I played in those games, just sometimes Yi has the hand to win. So, didn't feel bad. Moved on, first loss, 5-1 at this point, and then I move into my next round, which is a Kai'Sa. I have been luckily able to avoid Kai'Sa this whole setup, so I was very concerned about what would happen here. Sat down against my Kai'Sa opponent, and we begin playing, and my deck gets to do what it gets to do. I get to play my Mind Splitter after Mind Splitter. I'm taking away their Reigns, taking away their Watchers, and I'm able to eke out a 2-0 into the Kai'Sa. I'm very comfortable in the Kai'Sa matchup because it's obviously the one you have to play the most. It is still not a winning one for Yasuo. It is like 47% maybe for Yasuo, so it's not bad, but it's not one that I want to see. So we're able to 2-0 that one, which went smoother than what I expected, so that was good. And then we went up into the feature match. The feature match I'll put a link in the description so that you can see how that one went out. But I was very nervous to see yet another Yi, as Yi can be a very flippy matchup, as I've mentioned. I just have to play a sort of... I just always lose to one line, and there's nothing I can do to really fix that. But we sit down, and they flip Aspirants, so I know it's an Aurora game. And I start to get pretty excited, because my deck is very strong into Aurora Yi. There's very little Aurora can do when I have 3 Rebukes in my deck, as well as a few, Fight or Flights. And my Defy can also just stop their Catalyst, so they get off to a slower start, and their units just aren't doing what they need them to do when I can push them back and keep gaining tempo. So I felt very comfortable in this matchup too, and we ended up taking out that one. The game 2 of this set, I went back and watched, and I did not remember putting 2 on guards into Azonias. That was just horrible. I watched it back, and I was so mad at myself for putting that play on, a feature. You should never be trading 2 on guards for Azonias, because the Zonias will just not matter in the whole matchup. You're just going to get the last points. You don't really need to clear their guys. I was pretty mad at myself for rewatching it, because then I'm watching that last turn, and any Defy or on guard would just lose me the game, and if I have those 2 on guards, then I don't have to rely on Ride the Wind, and I don't have to gamble that he doesn't have an on guard. So, that game was pretty poorly played, but we ended up sneaking it out because my opponent just didn't have the correct cards at hand. Sometimes it happens. Again, that's card games, but I felt pretty bad about rewatching that play. And then that brought us to Top Cut. That feature match was the last one that I needed to guarantee a spot in Top Cut. And at this point, I was still, really anxious that I wasn't the top Yasuo. I was just trying to make sure if there was any other Yasuos in like all the rest of the day. It was the only thing I really cared about. As soon as we got into day 2 and we saw the list of legends, a huge weight went off of my shoulders, and I was able to just focus on playing at that point. That being said, Top Cut went pretty poorly for me. I will talk about some of the other particulars in a bit, but now I will just talk about the match itself. The match itself, my player was extremely strong. They played in every one of the Chinese tournaments, and they made top cut in 3 out of 5 of them. That's what they were mentioning to me. And my opponent played a very professional game. In game 1, I got completely blown out. Sometimes it just happens against a Kaisa hand. There's nothing I can do. I played Mind Splitter. I opened up their hand. I saw 2 Falling Stars, a Stupefy, and a Smokescreen, so I know that my Mind Splitter can never stay on the board. My Kaisa opponent's is at 5 points, and I just concede. Hypocritical to my point earlier, where you should always try to play it out, I just respected my opponent enough to see that there was no way out of this game. There was no top deck I could get. There was nothing that I could do to both clear their board next turn and somehow establish into a winning position. So that was a turn 3 concede in top cut, which is, not exactly how you want to start the set. Game 2 went much better. I was able to get some surprise tactics onto the opponent. Flip a Tide Turner, swapping places with the Mind Splitter to take a combat back from what it should have been. And game 2 ended up being a win for me. Game 2 also started with a bit of a mishap on my side, where my opponent played Arena's Greatest, and I ended up missing the trigger on that. So I was down a full point for the game. It didn't end up mattering because I was on the correct breakpoints throughout the game, but I was really beating myself up over missing a trigger when I hadn't done that for most of the tournament up to that point. So I tried to just, tell myself it is what it is and lock in. I didn't really take too mind for the points. I just looked at what the points as they were and didn't focus too much on missing a trigger like that. So we go into game 3, and game 3 was very competitive. We were back and forth for a lot of it. I was on second, so it was a tough game to begin with. Windswept in Reaver's Row is always a difficult game, but if I can establish a big body and keep it alive, then I can. I ended up just playing into a ton of flip lines as well, because, as I'll get into later, my opponent knew my full deck, so that lost a lot of surprise on my side. So I was just going for full gamble at this point. My opponent played really strong, and in that matchup and in that particular game where I'm not only down because the favor is on the Kaisa for the matchup, I'm also down because I'm going second. I just played every gamble that I could, and it didn't really pan out for me, which is fine. That was how it goes. My opponent played super well. I was very gracious to even be in the top cut to begin with, and I was very proud of what I managed to do. Getting top Yasuo, of course, was the whole goal of the event, so I felt very good about that. But I do want to talk about the biggest miss of the event for me, which was how Top Cut ended up being handled. We sit down for Top Cut, and first of all, there was no deck checks. I would expect that in the Top Cut, everyone would get deck checked, and everyone would have, we would go through that process, but there wasn't. That was a little odd, but not the end of the world. I mean, generally, people at that level are, I would hope, are trustworthy. And I didn't see anybody really futzing with something like that, so it was not a huge deal. But the bigger problem was the fact that it went to open decklist due to a software error. This was a major blow to me in particular, because I am playing a rogue deck that no one practices against and no one really knows what cards are in it. My feature match, I was pretty lucky to not show off a lot of the more tricky cards and a lot of my Kaisa Tech cards. So I was in a fairly fine position information-wise on what my deck was. And my opponent being given my full deck list really hurt my chances for what I could do. Tide Turner is usually a very surprising card, and now my opponent knows to play around it and is a constant thing that they're thinking to play around. My opponent asked for trash before I'd even shown off Raza. My Raza wasn't on the tournament stream either in the feature match, and that's also a fairly large surprise moment that I have in my pocket that was taken away for a tournament organizing error. The UVS site had been having issues throughout the day anyway, where the deck list submissions were also breaking in general, so everything went to paper. So it was very strange even that someone was able to see all the deck lists and we had to go to open because of that. I truly believe that I could have had very strong chances to take the event if it was not open deck lists. Playing through a Kaisa is still difficult, especially a Kaisa of that caliber. But if I have the advantage of surprise on my side, then I believe that bracket looks very strong for Yasuo. The top 4 being Yi and a ton of Annies meant that I would have a very strong chance to play through all of those. Annie is a matchup that I like. Yi is a matchup I like, even if it's flippy. I'm still favored into those, as well as the MF Auroras. So it's really just getting through the Kaisas and allowing myself to play my trick lines to catch off guard my opponent in the Kaisa matchup, which is exactly what I couldn't do as soon as I sit down for top cut. I just hope that these errors can be fixed in the future, or they can be communicated that it should just go to top cut open anyway. We go in with the expectation that it's closed and it ends up being open is a big blow to deck building. I would change my deck building. If I were to go to open decklist, I'd probably have a Ride the Wind in main so that my opponent is forced to play around it in game 1. But what can you do? At the end of the day, we still achieved our goal of what we wanted, which was top Yasuo. So I can't feel too bad of how the outcome ended up being. I just wanted to, put my thoughts out there on that specific situation. I think the judges ended up handling it really well for what it's worth. I think them making the decision to go to open after, I think it was only one person saw deck lists. I think going to open at that point was the correct decision. And I think the way it was handled afterwards was very professional and everyone was very, good and quick on getting it to what it needed to be. But the fact that the error happened in the first place and potentially lost me a lot of percentage points for winning definitely is not something I can feel happy about, obviously. So yeah, that was the overall tournament run. That was the overall deck. I hope you enjoyed me just going through and talking about it. I can probably put out videos about specific matchups. Maybe I'll start with Annie or Kaisa or Yi, because those seem to be the big ones. Let me know which one you want to see first, which matchup you want to see me go into depth first in the comments. But for now, thanks for watching. I hope you learned a lot.